So welcome to another video from theplayersaid.com. My name's Alexander, and today it is the latest episode of From Cover to Cover. This is a series of videos where we're tying in books that I have read, typically history books or some kind of book relating to war games or wargaming in some way. And we have a discussion about the book itself, what kind of a book it is, what it's like, and then I'll give some recommendations for games that kind of tie into it or go along with it or are very much what's covered in the book as well, so that you can expand your hobby horizons. If you're a book reader, you might find some games that you might like to play and interact with what you've read about. Or if you are just a wargamer, hey, let's get you a step back and let's read some of the history behind some of that stuff, or let's read some of the accounts that the games are named after. So, the first thing that we're going to talk about today is the book itself. So, we have this. Okay, today we're talking about With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa by E.B. Sledge. So this is a very famous book, especially here in the US, but also abroad. This is a first-hand account. It's like a memoir from E.B. Sledge, or as he was known in the book, Sledgehammer, that was his nickname, of his journey, his experience with 5th Marine Division in the Pacific. Specifically, he was in the campaign at Peleliu and Okinawa, as you may well have guessed. So, this particular edition, this is a really nice hardback edition from the Library of America series of books. This is it's a collection of books. This also have Flights of Passage by Samuel Hayes and Crossing the Line by Alvin Kernan. It's a wonderful book itself. As an artifact, it's great. It's this lovely cloth-bound green with a lovely green embossing in it. Nice little green bookmark, and I also have my annotations and stuff were with little green notebooks because I was like, oh, I want to keep it all because I'm a big aesthetic guy. There's good maps in this. This book has photographs in it from Sledge and from his experiences, and there's a lot of other maps and diagrams in it to really help. The other thing that I'm gonna mention here is that this book was the first book part of the fairly loose and informal Players Aid book club, which is more of just like we tried to do not a read along, but a little bit of a book club, because we have a books channel in the Slack that's available for our patrons, and I just post in there about the books that I'm reading, and people like to talk about that. And when it came to some of these, someone suggested, well, let's do a little mini book club. We'll all read the same book, and then we can have a bit more of an in-depth, focused discussion about those things. And so it was voted upon that With the Old Breed would be the first one of those. And so people have been reading it or listening to audiobook versions of it, ebooks, physical copies. And just at the end of February, the end date for that was February. I had about a month and a half, 2 months to read it. And the discussions that we're having, I appreciate them very much, right? I love wargaming. I love wargaming so much, but I love wargaming because it's a way to interact with history. It's a little bit of a time machine. It's a way to go back. And it's also, wargames are also, kind of like books, something of an empathy machine, where you have to go and do the stuff. And part of you cannot help but be influenced by what went on. And for you to feel something human, a connection to those little cardboard pieces that were human people, and for that to impress something upon you. You know, we can take a step back and we can do all of the high-level gaming, but I do think that there is something to say about wargaming and interacting with history, right? It's something, there's a reason we don't just read books. Books are excellent at that because they convey someone else's point of view, which helps us to expand our own points of view. But physically moving, making some of those decisions, trying to change what happened, there's something really, really important about that. And I think that's why gaming has been around for so long, and simulations have always been something that we've looked for as people to help us to reckon with what happened, or to recreate that, to step into those shoes, or to redefine what happened, or to try to change the past in our own little way of like what could have been. Anyway, so all of that to say is that I have really, really loved the discussions that we've had about this book. It was interesting seeing the spoiler-free journeys that people were going through of like, oh, like you'd get to a part of it and it was like, oh. And the discussions we've had have been fascinating. Now, this book, it is a personal memoir by E.B. Sledge, and he was just a guy who volunteered for the Marine Corps in World War II. And we say that as like he was a very normal person. I don't think he had any pretensions of trying to go into the military before war broke out. I don't think that would have been on his cards in any meaningful way. And so when I say it's like he's just your everyman going in and doing something for his country and for what he thought was right, I think that is a massive part of why this book has resonated so significantly with people over the years, over the decades, because this is like the quintessential American World War II story. I think when people talk about someone volunteering and going and doing their part and that being an act of bravery and heroism, this is that. This is like pound for pound an example of what that is, right? So I think this is a very easy book for people to relate to and digest, because it a lot of I don't want to say stereotypes, but I think a lot of people's views in the zeitgeist are based upon a story not dissimilar from Sledgehammer's. So, the book itself, I didn't know what to expect going into it. I had watched The Pacific, which is the HBO miniseries directed by Tom Hanks, and part of that is Sledge's story. He's the red-headed guy from Alabama who's in the mortar crew. All of that is from this memoir. And what I will tell you is if you've watched that, some of it is like word for word recreated from the book. Like I was impressed at the justice that they had done to the stories that he relates in the book. That was something that was immediately apparent. So if you've watched that, I felt like this was a really easy read to get into, because I already kind of knew some of the stuff that was going to happen, and having a little bit of foreknowledge, you're not going to be surprised by a memoir. Like, that's just not what memoirs are for. But I could focus more on the individual interactions and the details, because I knew some of the broader things that were happening in the battles that were fought and the tactical situations, because you'd visually seen those. So there was a little extra layer of it being a bit easier for me to access because of that. So if you've watched that, this is like a 10 out of 10 book. This is not an easy book to read, is what I would also say. The book is really good. It is also very hard to read at times. It's very harrowing. It is very terrible. It's sorrowful. There is a lot of awful things that happen in this book. And I will come back to this again and again. Sledge is just a person. And the simplicity with which he writes and the plainness of his language makes the experiences all the more horrifying. He's not hiding behind any literary devices, or he's not using language to elevate things for any artistic sense. It's just a person relating his experiences as he saw them, and it's almost, some of it is so matter of fact that you're just rolling along of like, this is what was happening, and then this and this and this, and then all of a sudden there are inflection points in this book, and they're not big tactical inflection points. It's not the course change of a battle. The inflection points are the things that it is very clear that have stuck with Sledge over his years. It is very obvious to me the things that recur in his dreams and nightmares, and the things that he can't clear out of his mind, because those things are described in such a level of precision and detail that it's like he hasn't stopped thinking about this for the 20 years between when he read this, when he wrote this, and when he started his service. Or maybe not 20 years, but those time betweens. It is very clear that where some of those things come from. And as such, there are times where you feel that. It's impossible not to be struck with the terribleness of some of the things that happened. But you also get moments of beautiful humanity and moments of great heroism, and also moments of great reflection as well. Some of the conclusions that he draws at the ends of his book are there's the kind of things that you would think of, and we might read a couple here because I think some of it's very poignant. But also, I don't know if I was shocked, but I was surprised just at how openly and broadly he talks about the awful waste of like human life and that war is. And it was very close to becoming like how a collection of like Siegfried Sassoon or Wilfred Owen's World War I poems are in like from their influence standpoint. Like those, you read those and it's like, these are anti-war poems, and it's very obvious that that's how that ended up. And this book could have turned into that very quickly had he not reflected in the way that he did at the end of the book. And I was kind of shocked by that. And I don't know why, but it was just like he does not pull his punches of where he was like, on the ground, we had no idea what the point of any of this was, or like, it was just kind of like dehumanizing to see like the terrible waste of people's lives being chucked away. It was very interesting where I was like, there's some pretty like anti-war sentiments in this that I just wasn't expecting that. I don't know what I was expecting going into it, but it wasn't there. And he just like lays his opinions out there and like, I find that very refreshing, honestly. So a couple bits that I just wanted to highlight. I'm just going to read some of them. I've marked some of this up because, he goes through basic training and he talks about the thoroughness of his training that he went through and all of this stuff leading up to this. And then when he gets to the Pacific and they land on Peleliu, it's exactly what you would expect, right? Yeah, they're well trained, but a lot of these soldiers were green and they're just being tossed into what he refers to as the abyss. And he goes through and describes the campaign and where they moved and what they did and what it's like to set up these mortar pits and the kind of terrains and enemies they were up against. And then all of a sudden you get these moments in the book and he says, time had no meaning. Life had no meaning. The fierce struggle for survival in the abyss of Peleliu eroded the veneer of civilization and made savages of us all. And there are parts of that, and he talks about how there's an incomprehensibility, not a word, of the things that they went through and the degradation of life when you're just in mud and guts and fearing for your life the whole time and you can't leave your pit to, when nature calls. All this stuff, he's like, no one who wasn't there will ever know what this is like. We weren't humans, we weren't people at that time, but it's such simple language where he's just like, that's how it was. It was terrible. But again, and there's moments and moments. There's a part towards the end in Okinawa where he has to dig a pit, and he's digging like through a Japanese body that's been buried and like rotted for a few, and it's like he talks about like the shovel hitting the rib cage and scraping off the sternum, and you're like, oh, it's so awful, the detail that he describes, and it's almost hard to picture that, right? Like, it really is, but the clarity with which he relates that, it is evident that I don't think those things ever left him. Nor how could they, right? But then at the end, after the two big campaigns that he's a part of, seeing an unconscionable amount of his comrades be killed or injured. I mean, the casualty rates were in the thousands. He states a lot of statistics, and they are staggering. Like, I don't think I knew. Like, we talk about, oh, there were thousands and thousands of casualties, and he's like, cool. The division was like 3,000 people, say. I can't remember the exact numbers, but he's like, 800 people were uninjured. Like, that's... Oh, like, over 2/3 of people were either wounded or killed in act. That's 10%, and you lose combat effectiveness, and it's like, all right, we're so much more than that. It's really an incredible read. But he goes through all of this, and at the end of it, the line that sticks with you, and it really is like, it's part of, I don't know, the spirit of that generation, I feel. It's really simple. He just says, basically, if the country is worth living in, then it's worth dying for. I think that sums up a lot of what the attitude was, especially at the time, of people who were called on to do things that were frankly unthinkable and unimaginable, and you can only do them if you're put in that situation, right? Like, so much of this stuff, the heroism and the moments that happen, it's from a course of need, and hopefully we're never put in that situations where we're forced to make those kinds of choices. But what I would say in closing is that this is an incredibly heavy book. There are a few points of light in it, but not many, and it is just one man's experience, and it really is incredible. Some of my favorite parts in this were when he's talking to some of the old salts after Peleliu, and that guy who was I think he was at the Battle of Gloucester, I think is what they called it, and he was like, Sledge, that was the worst thing I've ever seen. I never want to do that again. I'm ready to go home. Oh, and that was from someone who had fought in World War I as well. He was like a 50-year-old guy who like stuck with the Corps, and just like, and Sledge was like stunned that this person who was a hardened veteran, so to speak, and had seen the horrors of World War I, was like, Peleliu was too much for him. He was like, I'm done. That's how awful it was. There were parts of this book that were so striking, but if you haven't read this, it was an amazing read to see something that's not from like a professional author or an artist, which is a lot of fiction that I read is from someone who's trying to tell a story and trying to play with their language. There's none of that in here. It is just very plain and very matter of fact, and it's just him relating his experiences, and the experiences are enough to carry this into being, what is effectively a piece of a modern classic memoir at this point. So, the book itself, 10 out of 10. It's very good, but not for the faint of heart, is what I would say. So, let's talk about some war games that you can play to go along with this. So there's some very obvious choices that we're going to go with to start with. So first we have D-Day at Peleliu. This is part of the D-Day at series, which is from Decision Games, designed by John Butterfield. This particular one, I picked this up a while back, but I haven't played this, but I will. I've been inspired to from this book. I have played D-Day at Omaha Beach, I played D-Day at Saipan, Grant's played D-Day at Tarawa. So we've played a lot of this series. I know exactly how this game works. And what I would tell you is that the system itself is excellent. It's really, really good. And so I have full faith that this will be a very good solo game. This is a solitaire-only game. You might be able to do a co-op option in it, but this is a solo game. This will be great. I know what I'm getting myself into when I play this, so I'm happy to recommend this, having not played it yet. That's kind of one of the big obvious ones. The other one, which is funny, I don't actually have the real thing. It's kind of on a shelf. So Fields of Fire, specifically Volume 2. This is not Volume 2. Fields of Fire Volume 2, it's called With the Old Breed. It's named after that book. And it has the World War II part of that has a lot of the battles and a lot of the campaigns that you read about in that book. This is Volume 1, and this is empty. I have mine in big shoe boxes, but it's not pretty to look at on camera. So, Fields of Fire, also a solitaire game. Now, this is a very complicated game. Very detail-oriented. There's a revised rulebook that's 100 pages. Like, it's not for the faint of heart, but if this is such a good game and such an interesting simulation. I really, really like it. But this also, like the book, not for the faint of heart. You've got to kind of put a lot into this to get to it. But Volume 2, with the Old Breed, very specifically has some of the stuff that you're looking for. Weirdly, I don't actually have any Okinawa games. Like, I looked through and I don't have any, so sorry about that. I might have to rectify that. So if you know any good Okinawa games, put those in the comments. I want to hear about those. Let's talk about some broader games, some more strategic level games, because that's one of the things that I think is very interesting about the book, is the book is focused like entirely on what K5 were doing, like his company K, 5th Marines, and there are a couple times where they're like, what are we doing at a broader level? There's a couple bits and pieces where it's like, it's hard to see the forest through the trees, and for all of the personal loss that these people were feeling, it can be really hard to see those big strategic choices that are being made by MacArthur and Nimitz and all that. So, Empire of the Sun. Another big fat game. This is huge, this is big, this is complicated. Peleliu is a tiny dot, it's a tiny atoll in a tiny hex on this big board, but you get to see the broader scope of things. You have 5th Marine Division as a counter, and they have to go on island hop. And you have to go on island hop, otherwise you will lose the game as the Americans. And you get to see that political and that home pressure that that helped propel a lot of these campaigns that were extremely bloody forwards. Some of them were necessary, needed to happen. Some of them, in hindsight, maybe we could have circumvented some of those things, but I'm not the person to judge. I don't know enough to have any qualified opinions on that, that's for sure. But doing the Pacific at a broad level, this is a very detailed game, and it's hard to go wrong with it. Again, this is much more on the complicated side. If you want something at that same level that's much less complicated, one of my favorite games is Pacific Victory. It's a game that you probably don't... I feel like I don't talk about this game enough. We've played it, and it's at a much kind of a broader, grander strokes. Let's see. Is Peleliu even on here? I'm sure it is. It is, yeah. But like, where Peleliu occupies one hex, it's like there's a bunch of atolls in these hexes. These are much bigger hexes. This is a block war game. This is much more gamey. It's going to play 2 to 3 hours. Maybe your first game's going to be a bit longer than that once you figure it out. But we played this. I loved it so much because I like the simplicity of the Columbia block war game system. I know a lot of people don't, but I have a blast playing it because it's just like very beer and pretzels, and what we mean by that is very casual. You know, I've got my blocks, they're facing towards me, you don't know what I've got, and we're moving around and scouting and then attacking each other, and then you reveal your forces, and it's like, oh, I'm deeply overmatched, whoops. There's a bit of chaos with some of like the storms and things that can go on, like you'll get a storm, and it'll be here, and all the hexes adjacent. It's just squalls, and you can't move your boats or anything like that. It's a very neat game, and it is a game, and it does not forget that it is. And so you can have a more enjoyable, relaxed time in this. Yeah, it's a bit longer than some of your, very casual games, but you're going to sit down with a family member or a friend. You're going to play this and have a really enjoyable time. And I think the last game that I will talk about very briefly is something a little bit different to all of these. I'm just going to show you the lid. This is Warfighter World War II. Very specifically, there is the Pacific core set, and as an add-on to that, you can get the Beach Landings core set, the expansion. So if you get those two things, you can recreate the beach landings of, frankly, any of these places. But what I love, Warfighter is also a not particularly serious game. We often play it cooperatively. You can play it solo. And it's very different tonally from this book, is what I would say, because it's much more like pulpy. So if you were to go back into like the 40s and 50s and see the old like World War II comics, and there's like, yeah, a dude with his helmet with the straps hanging down, he's got half a stogie in his mouth, and he's got his Thompson, like wielding it akimbo with his, Colt 45 or whatever, running around gunning stuff down. That's what Warfighter is at times. You are very much up against the clock, and you have, a small squad of guys, anywhere from like, 3 to 6 guys at most, and you are like running through these different terrain types and shooting guys, dealing with ambushes, and it's very rock'em sock'em, and it's like great fun to do. There's nice little action economies and all these special abilities and extra weapons and things that you can equip yourself with. It's just a really fun, enjoyable experience. It's not particularly like there's historical modules to it, but like what you're doing is just like charging to an end goal, going through, getting there, and then completing a task. It's not like quite as detailed a simulation as any of these other ones, where it's like, hey, this is who was here. Here's the order of battle. There were these guys, and they did this and that and this, and this is these constraints. It's a bit more. It's a bit more like side scroller. That's physically how the game is, and it's just a bit more. Like I said, it's a bit more pulpy. So it's a fun game. Great co-op as well. I really like it. But yeah, the Pacific module. That's a core set. And get the little the beach landings expansion. Just awful. It's very, very, very difficult, very challenging. But they present a really nice, different experience to some of the core stuff that you get. So that's kind of a look at some of the games that I have or have played that relate to With the Old Breed. I'm sure there's a trillion more. So if you have other games that cover, either Peleliu or Okinawa, especially Okinawa, let me know. I want to know about those. Or any other games, on the Pacific more broadly. Let me know what you think about that. If you've read this, I'd love to know what you thought about it, what your favorite parts of it were, things that stuck with you. Because when I talk about, well, here's my favorite quote from this book, you don't talk about this book in that same way. This book is more of a, here's this quote that stuck with me, because I couldn't get it out of my head because it was so tragic, or it was so poignant in a moment. Aside from the tragedy, there were times with this book where I had to close it and put it down, because it almost brings you to tears with what some of these gentlemen were faced with, and some of the situations that they were put in, and it really is quite a staggering book at times. So what I mean by that is you will be staggered. It's at times really, really tough to continue, and it's okay to take a break and do something else and then come back to it later. But I really probably can't recommend this highly enough as both a memoir and as an artifact of what was and what can be for humanity. So, With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa by E.B. Sledge. Check this out if this is something you're interested in. Lots of games we talked about, but appreciate you very much for sticking with me and tuning in. I've been Alexander from theplayersaid.com.